So tonight, as David mentioned, I'll be speaking about Vinland in fact and fiction. And that will be followed, if you can sit long enough, will be followed by a short reading from my chapter, my introductory chapter in a novel called The Vinland Way, set here in PEI. For obvious reasons, since we all know PEI is Vinland, right? Among the greatest epics of Western cultural history, perhaps none resonates as deeply for Atlantic Canadians as the story of Leif Erikson's 11th century discovery of North America and Vinland. Orally passed down through multiple generations in Iceland until finally recorded in writing a couple hundred years later, these sagas, collectively known as the Vinland sagas. Ooh, that should have moved. Okay, well, hold on now. Hold the thought, Vinland sagas. Okay. Is there a little... how'd you do that? Don't go away. Right there? Oh, okay, good. Okay. I love this kid. He's so great. He knows everything about technology. Okay, so we're on to the Vinland sagas, okay? And they've retained their powerful place in the cultural histories, the creative imaginations, and the national pride of Canadians, and particularly Atlantic Canadians. Would you like the light dimmed a bit? Yeah, I wouldn't mind. It's kind of bright. It's kind of like a classroom. You might want to relax and look at the photos. Yeah. Is that okay, Alex? Are you good? Okay. All right. Comprised of two separate, though occasionally overlapping accounts, the Greenland saga, or the saga of the Greenlanders, and Erik Saga Rauda, the saga of Eric the Red. These Vinland sagas recount the adventures of fascinating individuals, uncanny flora and fauna, and wondrous locales all throughout the legendary Vinland. Still today, after more than 1,000 years since Leif Erikson's epic journey, scholars, boat builders, sailors, writers, and enthusiasts from all walks of life pursue the intriguing clues left dangling in the sagas like a Dan Brown novel, enticing us either to take to sea in self-made boats of Viking replicas or to search for wild grapes, self-sown wheat, butternut trees, and other legendary icons of Vinland in our local geography, geology, botany, topography, and yes, in some cases, even in our own pioneer cemeteries and rocks in our own backyards. That's a pioneer cemetery near where I live. As a result of the search for the mysterious and the unexplorable, to borrow from Henry David Thoreau, some locales and icons have been discovered. This is Lonso Meadows, which most of you, I'm sure, know, is in Newfoundland. And just wanted to point out that before the legendary Ingstads went and discovered or recovered this historic site, settled by some of the Vikings in the sagas, there was a Newfoundlander named Howard Munn who wrote this fantastic book decades before the Ingstads showed up on the scene. And he said, "It's Newfoundland, I'm sure of it." And he was right. In their digs, however, the Ingstads discovered some very interesting artifacts, at which, of course, all these artifacts are also part of the saga. So the icons started and started to assume meaning. Here we have some tools that are women's tools, women's weaving tools, and they confirmed the existence and the story of Gudrid the Far Traveler, which is one of the famous stories of the sagas. But however, if you notice on the upper right side there, that nut is a butternut. Well, butternuts are not found in Newfoundland, and so that led the questers farther south. Where could they find butternuts? Well, as we know, they also had to look for wild grapes. And that on the left there is a wild grapevine growing up along the trees. And here are some trees with wild grapevines growing around. In the sagas, you might recall they mentioned that the grapevines were wound around the trees at a river, in a bay, in a lagoon that they called Hope or Hop. And the question is, from the saga scholars, where are these located? They weren't from Newfoundland, so the idea, of course, was that Lonso Meadows might have been only a temporary settlement, or budir, as they were called in Icelandic, which means booths or temporary dwellings. So the idea is that some of the saga, some of the Norsemen came and women came farther south to the northern part of the southern part of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So one of the questions is New Brunswick Hope? Is this part of Vinland? The reigning archaeologist of Lonso Meadows is absolutely sure that this part of New Brunswick is Vinland. However, there are many other people who disagree and have other theories. Nova Scotia is another reigning contender for the location of Vinland. And this is a supposed runestone found the past year along the beach in Vinland Bay on the southwestern side, south of Halifax, on the South Shore, near Lunenburg and all those places, that someone is claiming is authentic. It was sent to the head curator at a photo of it, not the rock, to someone in Norway who said that the inscription is Swedish. And it recounts one of the sagas famous with Swedish persona. However, this woman, Annette Kolodny, who is a very renowned scholar, has just come out with this book, In Search of First Contact. And she's led and provided a new perspective, which is that she's consulted Native American oral narratives. And by doing so, she was able to argue that the Passamaquoddy area, which unfortunately the U.S. decided to kind of go right through the lands, the ancestral lands, and create a boundary. But it is now in both countries of Canada and the U.S. But they claim that perhaps this is Vinland for a couple of reasons. One, if you see where Nova Scotia is there, and Mahon Bay is just kind of at the south part of Nova Scotia there. This is the mouth of the Bay of Fundy, as you know. There's a lot of current. So the idea of the Straumfjordur, which was one of the icons of locations that the Norsemen discovered, a place with strong currents, is located. And another interesting part of the Passamaquoddy is that in their oral narratives, they do speak of the repeated visits of white people with very pale skin and very tall, they also hold this color red as sacred. Now, why is that important? Because in both the Greenland saga and the saga of Eric the Red, the commentators refer to the red cloth that the native peoples they met were so enticed by that they were willing to give away furs for this red cloth. And the Passamaquoddy have only a few very sacred colors, and red is the prime one. Now, however, if we had some archaeologists here tonight, they would be very quick to point out that the ancestors of the Beotuks, the Dorset people, also held red as their sacred color. So there again, you can see why scholarly debates continue forever. Like James Joyce talked about his novel Finnegan's Wake, he said, it will keep the professors guessing for centuries. And Vinland, the location of Vinland may well be something like that. So, where does that leave writers, literary writers? Well, the scholars, as Gisli Sigurdsson has pointed out in his book, Oral Traditions and the Sagas, he has a big, long page of a table filled with, it's as wide as it is long, with all the reigning theories of the location of Vinland. So I decided to turn to literary writers to find out how were they interpreting the locale of Vinland, or how did Vinland hold importance to them? So some of you might know the literary reference here, but having spent many years myself researching and writing books on Herman Melville, Moby Dick, I decided to take poetic license and follow the reign of Ishmael and Moby Dick, who, after hundreds and hundreds of pages in Melville's novel, examines the whale from all different points of view, and finally says, I'm just going to follow Jonah and declare the whale a fish. And that's what he did. So, like the Vinland Society, I hereby declare Vinland, PEI, is Vinland. And that is the source, my inspiration, and my literary motivation for writing my current novel. So, before we embark on a bit of a reading from my work called The Vinland Way, which I'll be glad to talk about in a few minutes, I thought that we might explore some of the reigning literary writers who locate and how they locate themselves in the search for the great white whale of Vinland. Now, you probably are aware that in the last 4 decades or so, even though it started really about the turn of the 20th century, there have been quite a few novels written about Vinland. Many of them have been retellings of the sagas. Others have focused on particular characters in the sagas that the individual writer found of great import. Others have focused on the themes of Vinland, what Vinland meant for the individuals who journeyed here, how they lived in Vinland, and what they took away. This fellow, Thomas Pynchon, himself as elusive as the location of Vinland, had no problem locating Vinland, though for we islanders, we think he's a bit off in his geography. He set his novel Vineland in California. For him, Vineland is a post-apocalyptic Vinland. The lost world of pristine Vinland diminished into endless shopping malls, environmental destruction as evidence from the cover. And it's the dream of Vinland and its aftermath. It's a fascinating, powerful novel published in 1990. It's set in 1984, and those of you that know your literary history know that's Orwell's 1984, and Pynchon plays on that to great effect. This is another author named William T. Vollmann. Sad-looking fellow today. He also examined the post-Vinland world. He had written a novel, actually a series of stories called Rainbow Stories, that are set in endless industrial parking lots with prostitutes plying their trade. And after completing this work, he said to himself, I wonder what the parking lots looked like before, when the Norse first came. What was this world of North America like? And he created a series of 7 brilliant novels called 7 Dreams. And they depict the theme of the history of North America. And he talks about history as culturally determined, that the way that our cultural perspective shapes the way that we think of historical events. The Ice Shirt is the first novel, which I read as I was not driving, I was the passenger, driving back to the island. It's an absolutely brilliant novel, very Joycean in scope. And what it does is it counterpoints the Icelandic sagas, Native American oral narratives, with historical perspectives from various and different lenses. Vollmann also, in order to write this novel, went up to Iceland and Greenland. He lived on Baffin Island in a tent, almost froze his butt off, and he was really an amazing writer, because he tried to really recreate for himself what was it like for these Norsemen to come over the sea and to come to North America and live in a place that was so different from where they had come. His next novel is called Father and Crows, which is about the Jesuit exploration, and some might say exploitation of Canada, North America. The third was called The Rifles, and this is about Sir John Franklin's discovery of the Northwest Passage. In order to write this novel, Wollman went and lived among the Inuits for several months, following them, living their lifestyle. And so, as you can see here, he's the kind of writer who he mixes fiction and nonfiction. His own accounts of his experiences are interwoven into the stories he tells. So, in that sense, he recreates kind of the saga perspective, which was stories within stories within stories. On a more positive note, this is Meadowland by Thomas Holt, who is a British writer of historical fiction. And this novel is extremely witty and humorous. Yet, despite the dry wit and humor of it, the novel chronicles the repeated voyages of two Icelanders on all the voyages to Vinland. And the first-person narrator of the story is trying to figure out, here are these two wonderfully amiable people, and yet at the end they commit mass murder with Freydis and massacre the Icelanders that were with them and some Native Americans in the meantime. And this novel tries to understand how it is that a pristine natural environment like Vinland could not have a positive influence on the people who came. So that's an intriguing theme that is carried out in several different novels. This bleak outlook of human nature continues with Joan Clarke's Eriksdottir, which I'm sure most of you have read, which is described by Miss Clarke as a study of the harsh crowd of Greenlanders, as she called them, who journeyed to Vinland. Focusing on the outsider Freydis, one of the characters in the saga, Clarke chronicles the effect of alienation and greed upon the Vinland discovery, resulting in a novel that serves as a meditation on the nature of the human spirit, she said, its courage and its treachery. Now, mind you, in preparation for this talk, I read about 10 Vinland novels, and they're all at least 450 pages. So I had repeatedly different versions of the Freydis story and the Gudrid the Far Traveler story. And it was very interesting because Joan Clarke's novel was the only novel that really tried to provide deep insights into the persona, character, personality, emotional state of Freydis. So it was very, very interesting to read. Now, expanding on the literary quest for understanding the intrinsic nature of both the place Vinland and the people who explored it, some writers have adopted, luckily, a more positive perspective, as evidenced in the photo here of the smiling Margaret Elphinstone, a wonderful Scottish author who wrote the novel The Sea Road. And I highly recommend it. It's a literary feat told in the first person by Gudrid, the Far Traveler, as she's a nun in Rome speaking to an Icelandic monk who's scribing her story. And this novel is the account of Gudrid's life. And remember, you might recall that she's the one who bore the first known European child in North America. The novel explores the role of fate and the nature of place, declaring towards the end that the heart of Vinland was another world, which we couldn't enter without destroying it. And this was something that was of great concern to Gudrid. And so she concluded that Vinland was not a place for the Norsemen to exploit or to gain from. And so she finally came to the conclusion that she thought that it was best that the Norsemen went back and didn't stay in Vinland, that it should remain a world separate, which is an intriguing concept. And there's the cover of her novel, The Sea Road, yet another Viking boat. Many of them have Viking boat covers, as you might imagine. The next author that we're going to look at is Cecilia Holland, a historical fiction writer who, like Vollmann, created a series of novels she lovingly calls the Viking series. And she is very interested in the cultural exchange of the Celts, the Norse, and the Native Americans. In her novel, this is the second novel in the series, The Witch's Kitchen, she portrays Vinland as a mystical and pristine natural world elsewhere, in which the protagonist, the formerly enslaved mystical Celt from Ireland, Corban Loosestrife, finds himself soulfully drawn. He leaves behind the world of Europe, the world of battles and power and ambition and greed. And like Huckleberry Finn and Mark Twain, he hikes out for the territories. And he goes back to Vinland and disappears into the forest with the native peoples around him. This sense of Vinland as hope, reflected in the smiling face of this well-named author, Jane Smiley, forms a central theme in her novel, The Greenlanders, which you also might have read, that came out about 1988 or so. Although the novel depicts the decay of the culture of the Greenland settlement to the point where, as I'm sure you know, that by the middle of the 15th century, when some Norwegian ships went to Greenland, they couldn't find a person. Not a soul existed anymore. And no one really knows to this day what happened to the Greenland settlement. So Jane Smiley decided to write a novel about it. She called it, as she was writing it, she said it was like living in a dream, that she'd write for 12 and 14 hours straight, not even realizing she was doing it. And with her very next novel, she won the Pulitzer Prize in fiction. But towards the end of this novel, there are two ships filled with 15 men and women, and they take off for Vinland, just as the culture in Greenland is really getting to a point where there seems to be no hope. So Jane Smiley, through this image of these two ships taking off for Vinland, offers this hope of Vinland as a world elsewhere, a new world where people can live in harmony with the natural world. As a writer myself, I am ineluctably drawn to and inspired by the motifs of Vinland as hope, as a world elsewhere, as a Walden by the sea, so to speak, which is the topic of a blog that I keep here. And also the idea of a pristine place, largely subject to its own natural whims of wind and waves, much like today when I was driving from Eastern PEI to come to Charlottetown with our 70 kilometer per hour winds. It reminded me of a the Thoreauvian concept of the tonic of wildness, where one can live in harmony and know that nature can't be subdued, especially on my side of the island. But I'm also drawn to the actual pristine place of Prince Edward Island. And I have sought in my own novel of Vinland to conflate the scholarly research on the search for place with the literary search for the meaning of Vinland. I call it the Vinland Way, a title which conflates the cultural aspects of contemporary life on Prince Edward Island, celebrated, as you all know, by the phrase the island way, with the way or veg, which is Old Norse, which reflects and represents the journey and the settlement of Vinland. As you might think of it as you listen to the introductory pages of the novel as a Vinland Da Vinci Code, so to speak. Oops, I did something wrong. Well, anyway, just have a look at that, and I'm going to switch text now. So this is the beginning, chapter 1. Mac and MacDonald stood in the pre-dawn light, alternatively glancing from the construction site to the dark sea beyond, as he tossed his phone nervously from hand to hand. "Damned if I do, damned if I don't," he mumbled. With a shake of his head, he took a deep breath and started clicking. Here goes nothing, or everything. Iona McLeod woke to the insistent ring of her mobile before it stopped, only to resume again. She stretched out a reluctant hand from under the down quilt. Macken's voice sounded unusually stern, if not outright distraught. Iona, I know it's early, look, but we've uncovered something odd, really odd. I shouldn't be telling you this, but... Iona mumbled, her head buried in pillows. What time is it? She had been immersed in her Viking dream again. In recent days, its equivocal images, like a slideshow playing recurring scenes in her mind, seemed to occupy her sleeping consciousness with ever-increasing frequency. She shook her head as if to fling the inexplicable images from her thoughts. Macken's tone shifted to an unusually sharp key. Iona, wake up! This is important! His tone shifted to a whisper. I could lose my position overseeing this project for telling you this, but you need to see what we've uncovered here at the site. See what? She yawned into the phone. Poking her head out from under her covers, she peered through her window to the still deep blue marsh and the violet sea beyond. For God's sake, Macken, are you digging in the dark? The minister's office has got us working 24/7 now to speed the project along as continued funding is tied to a preordained completion date. A pause. Macken could hear her rearranging her mountain of pillows as she turned over. Listen, Iona, this is your only chance to see this. I'm sure to get axed for bringing you in on this, but I've not seen anything like it here on the island, or anywhere in the Maritimes for that matter, he reported, his voice breathless. You'll need to come over right away if you want to protect them, that is, he urged. What is it you found? She asked as she leaned on one elbow, her innate sense of curiosity winning out over her sleepiness. Something historical, but what exactly I'm not sure. How historical, she yawned into the phone, not inclined just yet to move out of her nice warm bed. She glanced outside. The sun was just announcing its imminent arrival by broadcasting, well, it's not broadcasting the sun, it should be. Can't quite figure out why that didn't work, but anyway, you can listen to the words. The sun was just announcing its imminent arrival by broadcasting swirling streaks of color over the edge of the sea. Some of the boys think it's Akkadian, maybe Mi'kmaq. Me, I'd say older, much older. Whether the hint of an imminent dawn or the allusion to an obscure antiquity stirred her, Iona instantly shifted from slumbering to professional mode. How old? She asked in a clearly interested voice. If I didn't know any better, I'd say 800 to 1,000 years old or so, depending on what I'm looking at. Iona bolted straight up in her bed, now fully alert. What? What is it you're looking at? It's a rock. Well, actually, two. She leaned forward in anticipation. Describe them to me then. We dug them out together from the wall at the edge of the cemetery. The small one is almost perfectly round with a hole dug out in the middle, almost like a petrified donut. You would know, she said as she balanced the phone on one shoulder while trying to put on her robe over the other. You've eaten more than your share. Interesting thing about the stone, Macken continued, ignoring her ribbing, is that it's unlike any other rock I've seen here on the island. What kind is it, she asked. If I didn't know any better, I'd say, though it's covered in dirt, some kind of special soapstone, he surmised, which you might know we have none anywhere within hundreds of miles of the island. Really? She was up now. He paused, obviously sipping the tea, whether hot or cold, he carried around with him all day. I don't even think the rock is from anywhere here in the Maritimes. Never saw that kind in Newfoundland, or Labrador for that matter. Something different about it. And what about the other stone? That's where it gets really interesting. Why? She asked. She filled her kettle with water and placed it on the stove. You don't have time to make tea, Macken said crossly. You should come right away, Iona, before the others get here. Have a look at the stick-like markings on the other one. What kind of markings? You mean like the engravings on the tombstones in the cemetery there? They're centuries old, you know. No, these are really different. Stick-like, as I said, with long lines connecting them. And if I didn't know any better, would say Celtic or maybe Nordic, as in the Viking runes. What? Iona nearly screamed into the phone. Are you serious? Racing back into her bedroom, she barked out orders as she tugged up her jeans and tied her strands of wavy red hair into a knot. I'll be right there. Cover them up and don't move anything around them. Throwing on a sweater and her anorak, she grabbed her camera gear, hopped into her Jeep, and roared down the lane as she wrestled with her phone redial. No signal. Shaking her head in frustration, Iona tried again as she drove past seemingly endless fields of wild blueberries. Finally, just beyond the harbor at New Frey, she got a signal. For God's sake, Mackin, don't report it yet to archaeology. Iona's tongue was as sharp as the curve around Bear River she took nearly on 2 wheels. Oh, Iona, you know I'm supposed to, Mackin muttered. He could hear the roar of the machinery in the background. Never mind what you're supposed to do. Aren't I the site preservationist, she thundered. I'll never get near the place if they find out. Mackin paced back and forth. How long till you arrive? Some of the government people are supposed to meet here at the site later this morning. Oh God, she groaned. Which ones? The economic development boys, and maybe tourism as well. Keep them away, she nearly shouted into the phone. This could be a major find. I'm almost there. Turning off the main road, Iona swerved onto the dirt lane past St. Margaret's and sped down the lane to the restoration site. Arriving some minutes later, she screeched to a halt. She glanced around quickly. An old colonial cemetery sat to the left of the long entranceway Mackin was constructing to its right, from the road through the field to the dunes beyond. The place was in complete upheaval, with excavators and other heavy machinery digging here and there, interspersed with piles of rubble and dirt heaped in small hills all about. Iona rushed over to Mackin. Where are they? She demanded. Yeah, good day to you as well, he said before taking her by the arm and to lead her briskly along the way. Here they are, he announced, as they came to a covered mound. As she approached it, Mackin said in a sheepish tone unusual for him, some of the big stone got crushed by the excavator. What? She scowled at him before turning back to the mysterious mound. He threw up his hands. Well, we weren't expecting to unearth something of major archaeological significance. We were just opening the wall for the entrance to the new resort. Iona rolled her eyes. If it weren't bad enough to situate a megaplex resort, well, I had a lovely photo for you. A casino for the wealthy among the sand dunes that should be preserved. Don't you think it's a bit ominous to have a historical cemetery flanking its entrance? Mackin flushed. We've been through this before, Iona, he muttered. I can't stop the government from building here. He gazed at her with a shrug. And neither can you, apparently, despite your attempts. I can only ensure that it's built according to code, and you, that it limits its imprint on the environment and doesn't destroy any heritage structures. Iona scowled. You mean like the stone wall? She turned away. If these stones of yours are as historical as you implied, there won't be any building here, government sanctioned or not. Come on, let's have a look then and see what you think of them, Mackin said to steer the exchange in a new direction. Now let's see if I can get this to Alex. The brilliant one. Can you help me with it? I'd love to show you the stones. See if you can move it on for me there. Just go to the next one. There we go. All right, here's my Viking stone. With a cursory glance around, she asked, where exactly did you find this stone? Mackin pointed to a section of the stone wall filled with grasses about 1 meter high. We were removing that part to open it for the lane, as I said, he related, when it fell out, from behind the wall, actually. Iona stared in the direction of the wall, studying it for some moments, before shifting her gaze to another wall to the left of the cemetery. They're of an equal height, she said. Just the old way of building up cemetery walls, he said with a shrug. Guess it depended on the size of the rocks available at the time. Iona just shook her head. "There's something different about this wall over here on the right," she said with a little mound of grass behind it. She said, "See, look, at the left edge there." "Oh, maybe a bit of a difference. We'll deal with the wall later," Iona said. Bending down on her knees, Iona stared at the figures seemingly etched in the stone. "It's all geometric, no rounded characters, and it seems to have the line orientation of runes," she announced. She shook her head. "But it could be Celtic, as in Ogham script." She glanced up at him. "Although I did have a few courses in Norse archaeology in Edinburgh, we only covered a bit of runic inscriptions, the kind found in the Hebrides, not enough for me to say anything definitively." Yay, worked. She turned back to the stone, and it doesn't bear any resemblance to the gravestones from what I remember of them with their rounded scrolled designs. Iona just stared down at it, shaking her head gently. "Well, decide what you're looking at before the big boys arrive on the scene," Mackin said with annoyance. "Any minute now, they'll be coming. I'll leave you to it." "Thanks, Mackin," she said, but he had already walked away. She gently touched the edge of the stone, feeling its cool softness, taking care to avoid the inscription. Iona sat down next to it, her hand remaining where she had placed it. Gazing around, she studied each aspect of the scene: the stone wall, the field beyond, the sand dunes and the beach beyond that still, with the iridescent blue of the sea in the morning light framing the setting. As she sat staring at the scene, her eyes started to glaze over as images from her dream floated through her mind. She closed her eyes. A wooden boat with a long winding stern among the waves. A grass-covered hut with smoke curling from its roof. A woman bending over her weaving. Some men chopping wood. A voice called out, "Iona!" She opened her eyes and with a furtive glance around stood up. Mackin was walking back to her. "So what do you think?" He stood with his arms folded over his chest, his blue eyes, usually the color of sunlit sea, now storm gray. "Some of the boys think it's just a practice stone, the type they used to chisel on before attempting the gravestone." Iona glanced from the cemetery back to the stone. "There's really no comparison. The carving style isn't the same." She tossed her head in the direction of the graveyard. "Those are rounded with elegant curves and decorations." Bending down over the stone, she said, "But this, as you said yourself, is completely different altogether." Mackin nodded. "Like the smaller stone, which I'd say is a creamy soapstone of sorts, different from anything I've encountered." "I haven't seen that one yet," Iona said and looked up with dancing eyes. "Let's have a look." We're going to try to have a look. Thank you. Just the next one there. There we go. Thank you. "Let's have a look," she said. He directed her around to the other side of the first stone. "It's under here," he announced as he lifted off the tarp. Iona bent down to examine the small rounded stone. "It has markings on it as well, like the ones on the bigger stone," she said with clear excitement in her voice. "It looks so familiar to me, yet I can't quite place it." She continued to stare at it before shifting her widened eyes to Mackin. "You said you found these together?" He nodded. "That one seemed to roll off the large one." Iona turned away, her glance resting on the stone wall behind them. "And that wall," she said in a pensive tone, "reminds me of something I saw recently in an article." She shook her head with a thoughtful toss. "Maybe Gaelic, maybe something from the Hebridean runes," she murmured before lapsing into silence for some minutes. "Or maybe," she said, her tone rising, "I'm thinking about an image from the supposed runestone found in Nova Scotia down there near Vinland Way, right on the beach of all places." Oh, you saw that image before, didn't you? What can I do? Just press the enter button so I don't have to...
Arrows, right there.
Oh, you just... He's good at that. I'll get confused. Another arrow. There we go. Okay. She turned back to meet his gaze. Though their stone is quite different, with some sort of serpent-like engravings on it, there was a stone wall behind as well, filled with moss, but jutting out a bit like, she pointed to the right side of the wall Mackin's crew had been opening up, like those two rocks at the end there. Mackin whistled softly. "Oh boy, the government boys aren't going to like the sounds of that, I can tell you." He tossed his head as he bent towards her. "From what I hear, The Macau investors will withdraw their support if this place isn't built right here and right away. I don't care, she said. Let's see if I can do an arrow. Yep. Yeah. I don't care, she said. Let's see, where was I? Yes. There shouldn't be anything built here on these sand dunes, and you know it, Angus O. MacDonald. For God's sake, your own ancestors are buried in this cemetery. You want their spirits watching fancy cars and even fancier people from the way sweep by on their way to their luxury resort? She offered a grim nod. They'll never rest quietly. You sound like a pagan with spirits agonizing over the use of their former lands. That's the cemetery. That's the spirits. Iona placed her hands on each hip and said, her tone defiant, "It's an old Hebridean custom to bury your dead in an undisturbed, tranquil setting." She gave him a smirk. "You might know more about your Gaelic traditions had you remained on the island instead of studying and working out west." Not meeting a beat, he volleyed back. "Or maybe it's something you picked up in your time up north," he said with pointed sarcasm. "Perhaps among the Northmen." Iona stared pointedly at Mackin. He could be so infuriating at times. "Well, there's more here than the ruins of a colonial cemetery building, and we shouldn't be digging in here at all until my boss in innovation has a look." "Not my jurisdiction. I report to the boss who signs my check in economic development." Mackin gazed at her with a somber expression. "Are you sure about all this, Iona?" He gazed at her with a cocked eyebrow. She looked at him. "What do you mean? You called me." Shrugging, he said, I know, but sometimes we want to see something so badly that our brains just conjure it up in fragments of related shapes. Sort of like what happens to hunters so eager to shoot a deer that any shape even remotely resembling one, including their hunting partners, gets transformed in their brains to the coveted shape. Iona grimaced. "I just know I'm right about this," she said with that stubborn tone that turns her into a sheer face of an implacable mountain. "That rock, whether Ogham, Norse, or Aboriginal, is telling me something that I'm missing here, and that smaller one is connected to it somehow." She stood up and, rubbing off some soil from her hands, added, her green eyes blazing, "And I'm determined to get to the bottom of this mystery." Mackin rolled his eyes. "And how do you intend to do that?" "Trace the way back to the carver of those stones, and with it, with a wave at the wall, perhaps the builders of that wall or whatever might lie behind it." That's the wall. With a backward glance, Mackin said in a tone just above a whisper, "Well, you best hurry, because the minister's men have just arrived, and they'll be none too pleased over any attempts from you in innovation to delay, or worse, shut down their pet building project." Iona reeled around to gaze at a black Mercedes Jeep now screeching to a halt in a storm of red dust. She watched with widened eyes as the two impeccably attired Asian men stepped from the vehicle, followed by some government men in the SUV behind. Iona felt her heart stop. "Oh no," she exclaimed, "not him. He's directing the project? The minister himself?" With cheeks blazing, Mackin turned away. Yep. I was getting to that bit." She stared from Mackin to the stone, to the group of men approaching. "He hates me," she said flatly as she felt her stomach float up through her. "He's the one who got me transferred from archaeology to rural preservation under innovation." "I know," Iona, Mackin sighed. "You're lucky you have relations in the right places, or you wouldn't even have a position," after carrying her head in an indignant toss, loosening her knot into a tangled heap of red seaweed. "How can you have a heritage trail without any heritage houses and barns?" She shook her head sadly. "Aren't they all just fallen into ruins on our side of the island?" Sighing, she added, "It's all about tourism and money, just like this project." Mackin leaned down towards her. "Well, you'll need to convince him now, won't you, that an archaeological site, whether Gaelic or Viking, will be more profitable for the tourism numbers than a resort casino for the wealthy Asian investors." Iona groaned. "Distract him, will you? I need to think." "I can't fend him off for long, Iona." She placed her hand on Mackin's arm and gazed into his steely blue eyes. "Please, Mackin, not a word yet. Keep them away from me." With a deep sigh and a clipped nod, Mackin walked briskly away to greet the entourage. Rushing back over to the stones, Iona threw the tarp back over them, followed by her jacket and her bag before sitting down at its edge. She was determined not to bulge or divulge what lay hidden underneath. She waited half hidden in the anorak hood until the entourage moved past her along the driveway to the site of the resort. Grabbing her bag, she hurried down the field to the sand dunes and out to the beach. Gazing around, she could easily see why the government and the Chinese wanted to build here. It was a magnificent stretch of beach. Iona stood taking in the pristine scene before her. A gently sweeping beach extended for several kilometers in each direction, banked by hills of sand dunes covered in seagrass. A cascading series of waves rippled to shore along the curved stretch of sand, while a small rivulet streamed from its inland source out to the sea. A gentle breeze brushed the seagrass, causing it to sway, its long outstretched stalks of grain bending gracefully with each soft gust. As she continued to gaze around at the primal setting about her, she wondered if it might have looked exactly the same way to the carver of those stones as it did for her now. As she focused on the mesmerizing waves, thinking about the stones and their significance, she became cognizant of the images from her recurring dream flashing through her. Connecting the two, her internal and external scenes, she looked around with a fresh perspective, now considering the amazing possibility that the Norse came and perhaps even lived in Prince Edward Island. And suddenly, with a flash, Iona realized that she had seen that smaller rounded stone before, at Lonso Meadows. She closed her eyes to retrieve the mental image. She bolted upright, staring wildly out to sea. "Oh my God," she exclaimed to the waves. She was sure of it now. It was a spinning whirl, a woman's tool, a Viking woman's tool. She shook her head over the enormity of it all. And here on Prince Edward Island, of all places, long buried in a wall. Could PEI be Vinland? She dared to ask. She ran as fast as she could back to the site to report the discovery and halt the project. Thank you.